And we're live.
Today's serious day on the show.
That's right. Today's serious day. All right, welcome back to Corona Geek, here where we talk all about mobile app development using Corona SDK. I'm your host, Charles McKeever, and I almost forgot what we were going to say when we started, because if I don't follow the routine, I'm like all right.
There goes the rest of the show.
There goes the rest of the show. It's all the cheese is off the cracker. I say again, the cheese is off the cracker.
I don't even know what movie that's from. It's probably from a movie, though, right?
Probably. I don't know. I just made it up. All right. So last week we talked about game design. We've been doing a endless runner game series here for the past few weeks, and if you've been watching, following along, you will know that we've done organization of the project. We've identified assets. We have laid down code for walls. We've last week we actually added a player object and introduced touch inputs and camera movement. So if you haven't already, go check the show notes for Corona Geek 132, because there's a link in there that actually goes to the project itself, and you can download all the code and follow along with us. And if you go back to Corona Geek, I think 130, maybe 129, and 131, then you'll find all those different hangouts where we had those conversations. And we've also taken all those hangouts and split them into snack-size clips, so if you want to jump to just one part of the conversation, you can do that as well. So go check that out. Joining me today is our illustrious panel. We've got Dr. Brian Burton down in Abilene.
Oh.
We've also got Ed Marina from roaminggamer.com. He's currently drowning on dry land. Yeah, so we've already kind of talked about what we've been talking about, and but we are collecting show topics all the time. We've got a couple more weeks, I think, on this particular game development series. We're going to start a new one after that. But if you check the show notes for the for this particular show, you can find a link to the Hangout question suggestions thread in the forums. So go there and provide your Hangout topic suggestions. So we've got a running list going right now. What we're going to do is we're going to take some of those topic suggestions and we're going to actually split the Hangouts into segments so that we have maybe half game development and half answering specific questions and talking about different topics and stuff. So one of the most recently added topics was on consulting. People were interested in, doing consulting as a developer. So at some point, hopefully we'll get around to discussing that. But we need your suggestions. Go and provide them. We want to talk about what you want to hear about. Also, this month we are playing for Geek Games. Every month we play for a $50 gift card. We play a game, either on iOS or Android. And this month we are playing Zig Zag Boom, which is actually the game that we are using for the game development series. So Zig Zag Boom is an endless runner. Basically, it's a simple one-touch input, and it works on iOS and Android. So to participate, for play along and maybe get a $50 gift card, all you have to do is play for the high score, take a screenshot or a snapshot or a cave drawing of your high score, and then submit it to the Facebook wall on coronageek.com, or no, facebook.com/coronageek. And if you have the high score at the end of the month, then you will get a $50 gift card. So go ahead and participate in that. We've had some really great responses in the past. All right, so the panel, you guys there on the panel, what's going on? You guys got any news or updates or announcements?
Well, I'm working on prototyping some new books that are more advanced, dealing with cloud, in-app purchases, some of the more advanced or intermediate levels for game development and app development. So hopefully this summer I'll have something ready to actually show.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've had this conversation before. It seems like that you've written textbooks on the subject, so those are out there, which everybody can find at burtonsmediagroup.com. And then there seems like there's I don't know how you feel about it. I think there's a real need for more specific how-to kind of stuff, like you're talking about the cloud integration and things like that. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of pain points that those types of materials could address.
Yeah, and I've been working with Chris's Chromium IO and Chromium GS.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're wanting to do cloud development or anything that requires a back end, I highly recommend go to chromium.io or chromium.gs. We'll have links in the show notes. Chris has done a fabulous job of doing 99% of the heavy lifting for you. He's created some wonderful tutorials. Take advantage of it. It's there. When your app's out there making money, give a donation back to him so he'll continue working on this. It's really great stuff. I really encourage you to take advantage of that. And I'm hoping to write some things in the books that I'm working on that how to take advantage of what he's done to be able to use more advanced features, multiplayer games, multiplayer or multi-user apps, and hopefully get some things published this summer.
I wonder how many people would be interested in maybe a sort of a subscription service, because I know that you write your books and then you keep them updated, and then everybody who purchased the book then gets the update, and it seems like that's a great service to the end user, and but it seems like it would be a good revenue model to be paid to continually keep.
I would love to hear some feedback on that. I would, a subscription fee that went on for a couple of years, and that would be a great situation for myself. And I'd love to hear some feedback from everybody who's watching.
Yeah, I think even what, like $60 a year. I mean, I'm not trying to do your pricing for you, but I'm just something like even like $5 a month, like
right.
$60
That's
a year,
it.
and then
I heard $60 a year now. We're done.
Yeah, it's done. Yeah, but you know what I'm saying.
Disclaimer.
Yeah. There's this other this other web development stuff that I do, and one of the communities that I pay attention to, they actually have a video subscription, right? They have all these material, and then it's a month-to-month subscription, and then they're continually adding to that portal,
right.
and you get new stuff and things like that, and it just seems like that it seems fair, right? I mean, it seems like especially in a tech environment where things continually change and have to be updated, makes sense.
Right, and I will mention again that right now, if you purchase one of the textbooks that I've written, I am updating it 2 to 3 times, sometimes 4 times a year, depending on how much the Corona SDK changes in that year. And it's a continuous update thing. Right now, you purchase the book, it's free updates for the lifetime of the book. There may come a day when I no longer update the book, but it's not in the foreseeable future. So it's you continue to get the latest version with all the changes to the SDK. Additions, the first book that I wrote, beginning mobile app development with Corona SDK, I published that originally back in August of 2011, and it now has 3 or 4 more, maybe 5 more chapters than the original book, and everybody's been getting all those updates for that original purchase.
Yeah, because you keep your stuff updated, maybe a web format would be a good opportunity, a good format, to use the word twice, because then, I mean, and again, this other community, on the web development side, they were kind of like, okay, well, they have tiers, and right. their book is a portal, and then they have tiers, and then so you can buy the core book itself, and then there's advanced chapters, and maybe that would be something that would be good for you, because then you could provide that core book, like you're saying, and then when the chapters get updated and stuff like that, if people want updates to them, of course they would. Then they can go to that next tier or whatever. So I don't know.
So yeah, I'd love to hear feedback on that.
Yeah, so there you go. That's the main point. Go to burtonsmediagroup.com. Check out Brian's books. Also, provide us feedback. Tell us what you would like to do, what you'd be interested in. I know as developers, we're all, we know what we're talking about at this moment, right? You can't. I mean, putting something out there and being on the hook to support it forever for that same initial dollar figure that you brought in. It's kind of kind of a hard to do.
The expenses stayed the same.
That's the reason why the revenue models have continued to mature in the mobile space, right? If people said, okay, I can sell this thing for 99 cents. Well, that's great. Well, you just get that 99 cents one time. Yeah. Oh, well, wait a minute. Maybe I need to do in-app purchases. Maybe I need to do something that has a subscription-based, whatever. So, so we all know that's how that story goes. All right.
I was just going to tell Brian don't forget, with books never die. As long as the technology behind it exists, you will be getting emails from people.
Yes.
I wrote a book 8 years ago, and I got an email over the weekend from a guy saying, hey, I tried to go to your website to download that material from the book. And I'm like, yeah, I've had 2 websites since then. I ended up having to locate this stuff and put it out on the GitHub. I'm like,
Which I have to say is a great book. I had read the book that Ed is talking about before I ever met Ed, so it's a great resource if that's the direction you're going.
Yeah, well, it's still
the tool set we're talking about today.
We won't talk about torque anymore, though. Thank you, appreciate it.
Hey, Ed, did you have something?
I did, yeah, actually. I meant to bring up the screen here. So, those who followed along or who have read my blog over on my website or whatever may know that I have a number of goals for the year. Among those, one of my goals is to make 26 games within the year. And I was behind on this goal for a while. But last week or over the weekend, I think it was last week, I pushed 4 games to the Apple to iTunes. And I'm still waiting for them to get through, so they could get rejected. Fingers crossed they don't. But these games were one of the things that I wanted to do, among other things, was do a series of what I call mashups. And so what I wanted to do was take a core mechanic and create a game, and then modify that mechanic over and over with different game mechanics mixed in. So for this series, sort of as a warm-up, I took and made a Asteroids-like game, except I modified it in the sense that instead of just playing on with a ship and shooting, it has power-ups, so you get different kinds of weapons and shields and some other things like that. And then I released that as the base version, so there's one that's just sort of like Asteroids. And then I released one that is Asteroids mixed with Lunar Lander. So I took the Lunar Lander flying mechanics and applied those to the ship. So it's kind of hard to tell from the screenshot here, but this ship here has gravity, which is completely confusing at first, but then I think it kind of kicks in and people understand what's going on. So your ship can still pass through all sides of the screen and wrap around, but now you have to continually apply thrust, otherwise it just falls. And then, because we couldn't do one without Flappy Bird, I did a Flappy Bird flying mechanic. So again, you can wrap the screen, and the ship flies with it's got gravity, so it's always being pulled down. But you can tap the screen; it's a one-touch input, and give your ship a little thrust. But the problem is just like Flappy Bird, the ship orientation is always based on the direction it's going you're flapping, so the ship nose goes up. That's where the bullets are going. So you got to sort of time your flaps to not hit anything and to shoot things out of your way at the same time. I forgot what to mention. One of the mechanics I changed in Asteroids that took away from Asteroids was with Asteroids you had a separate button for firing. In this game, your ship is firing all the time, except for when you're steering. So if you're turning left, it's not shooting. If you're turning right, it's not shooting. If you're steering with both touches, so you touch both sides of the screen, it doesn't steer anymore, but the ship speeds up and it continues to fire. And that's another thing about this that people may not notice is when they're playing it, as they steer in all of these variants, the ship starts to go faster and faster and faster, which is sort of like a, whoa, hey, surprise if you're a constant steerer. Anyway, the last one was my favorite. I took the don't touch the spikes mechanic, which is basically don't touch the spikes, your bird will go in one direction, hit the wall, turn around, and come back. And it's sort of like a mix between, I don't know, a Pong and Flappy Bird. And so in this case, I took out the wrapping, which is part of normal Asteroids games. And you bounce off the sidewalls. If you hit the top or bottom, you die. And of course, if you hit the asteroids, you die. So this, of the 4 games, of the 3 mashups, was my favorite. Now, there were supposed to be 2 or 3 additional mashups, but I didn't complete them. I wrote them, but I didn't publish them because they were just not any good. One was a mashup of Retry. So Retry is that game by Rovio. It's kind of similar in mechanics to Flappy Bird in terms of the way it moves, but it's not an impulse. You can steer, you touch, and the plane will steer upwards and accelerate. And when you let go, it stops accelerating. Don't die on us, Brian. I see you over there joking. You okay? And anyways, and then I wanted to do another one, which was a mashup of Pac-Man. So your ship would be on a track and not able to adjust other than to steer as it hit segments of the track. But that was just terrible. So anyways, yeah, so that's my announcement. And I'm working on my 5th game. I'm almost got it done. So I'm today would put me off schedule again. I'm supposed to have published by today to be on track, but I'll publish a few days later this week. And it'll be better than these 4. It's my favorite game so far this year.
So is that again? You said you don't know if they're gonna
make it through the store.
Yeah, I think you make it through the store.
Yeah. Regardless, I'm going to be. I keep saying this, but I really am going to publish these to the Google Play Store in the next couple days. So I kind of wanted to let iTunes go first, but whatever. I'll throw them out there because these are so basic that I'm okay. But usually I will lead with iTunes and then follow with Google Play.
Okay. Interesting. Let us know how that works out, because I'd be curious to know if Apple sees that as too close of a variation to the same game or what.
Yeah. Well, I certainly hope they don't. There's a zillion Asteroids clones out there. So, but these are not. This is this is as close as I would ever get to a clone. It's right on the hairy edge for me. But it's a free game, and the purpose of this game is to explore mechanics mashups.
Gotcha.
And I needed a base. So the first one is the worst example of a near clone. And always makes me a little hesitant to do games like this because I'm very much against clones. So I tried to change this in a few ways. I changed the mechanics as far as the steering, little surprises, like I said, where the ship speeds up as you're steering, and you only fire at certain times. So I wanted to change the challenge of the game in terms of strategy, so it wouldn't be the same as Asteroids, which is 1 touch for steering, or a joystick, really, or 2 buttons sometimes, depending on which variant you're looking at, and then another button or touch to fire. That I didn't want to have anything to do with.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting. You mentioned the name of a game a moment ago, and I don't remember what it was, but I think it's interesting how game names have become sort of just one-word things, right? Like frustration.
Retry.
Yeah, retry. Frustration.
Retry by Rovio.
Right. Yeah.
It started out as I believe, as many games seem to in the mobile space, started out as a Flash game, I believe.
It's interesting. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, you kind of have to, and it's fine. I mean, once you get kind of creative and start branding things, it doesn't really matter what the name is. And
I forgot to mention the name of these games. I just totally winged it. Remember how I said in the previous series, I was really inspired by that guy who did that series AA, AU, all those different 2-letter games,
right?
Which were the same game over and over, but with one variation on the mechanic. So that's what inspired me to do this. I mean, I've already been thinking about doing a mashup before that, but at that point I was like, this guy did it, I can do it. I'm going to do it. So this, the base game is called AMUB, another mashup, or Asteroids Mashup B, base. And then there's AMU-LL, Asteroids Mashup Lunar Lander. So I'm trying to, for people who figure it out, they go, LL, Lunar Lander, FB, Flappy Bird,
right.
And so on and so forth. DTTS, Don't Touch the Spikes. But I'm not going to put the name of the game in the title.
Yeah.
because that would be a violation of. I just don't want to go there.
Yeah, right. Well, there's a certain mechanic there that says like Flappy Bird. It's easy to repeat. Easy for people to, and it's generally unique on searches. And people can find them even in like Google search engines and stuff like that. So, almost having words that you can make up that people can easily repeat can be a good thing.
Yeah.
It sets you apart from a space shooter.
I want it also, and the thing that's interesting about the iTunes store is, I don't know if you've encountered this, you go to look for a game, you know the title of the game, and you type it in, and you don't get the game back. You get somebody else's game.
Right. Yeah.
You're like, wait, I typed out exactly the name of the game, and I'm not seeing it. What's going on here?
Right. Yeah, and there's been times that I've had to actually put the author's name in as well in order to get the game. So it's very frustrating. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why I'm gonna kind of, I think my strategy this year is to come up with like really bizarro names that are easy enough to remember, but also are not going to be common. I don't want something where somebody types in the name of my game and gets somebody else's.
Today's game is named Banana.
That'd probably be pretty common. That's going to be a keyword, I'm pretty sure.
And that's the origin of C blurb for one of my games that's up there. I needed something really bizarre.
You gotta do it, otherwise, you're gonna get overlap.
Right.
Sounds like something my grandmother does on vacation. Blurb.
Yeah.
So that's about it. New game this coming week, and we'll just continue on. And a bunch of other things off my list, but those are later announcements.
Sweet. All right. Well, very cool. Well, yeah. So go check out burtonsmediagroup.com. We'll also put a link to the show notes to Ed's games, and also coronium.io. Go check that out. We had Chris on the show last week, and he was alluding to some updates that are coming, and he's already got some great stuff out there. So go check it out. Well, today's topic is an extenuation. Extenuation. That's a mashup. Is a continuation of a series that we've been working on. So we're going to do dynamic wall generation and particle effects today, right?
Right, and we'll have enough time to handle the logic for restarting the game when you collide with the wall.
Sweet. Okay, let's do that.
All right. So let me go ahead and launch here. You can see my screen already. What we're looking at here is basically where we left off last week. I've got the game running but paused. If I were to release it, the player would move and run into the wall. Let's see if I can do that. So momentarily, boom, it runs into the wall. We're done. So last week, this is where we left off. Now, of course, we could start steering, but we will quickly run out of hallway segments because those who are watching the series will remember that initially we made 1, 2, 3. Let me make this a little bigger so people can read it. We made 4 track segments. Our first one, we set a specific length, and then we auto-generated 4 more after that. So if we just trim this down a little bit, just to make it a little more tractable, see that even more. See there that we've got our initial segment and then a randomly generated segment after that. So the problem is we're advancing along, we've got the camera tracking the player and we're moving down the hall, but we need some way to generate more and more track segments as we need them. And the other thing we need to do is, assuming that somebody is really good at the game, if we don't delete the old hallway segments, eventually we're going to fill up memory and we're going to start bogging the game down. Now, in truth, for a game like this, most of the time that is not a concern. If you've played any of the catch-up games from last year, like Bounce and who's the guy that did Flappy Bird? He did that one with the new game with the helicopter on the head thing, where you're trying to go up through this hallway and you keep running into stuff. Anyway, the point is, most of these endless runners, people are not gonna. It's not endless. They get to like 3 or 4, whatever goals there are, and they're done. Right? The good people can do maybe a couple hundred or whatever, and then the rest people just cheat and submit scores of 9,000 and pretend that they got it. But the point is, is very rarely is somebody going to play this game long enough to fill up memory so they don't need to really remove track segments. That said, I'm going to teach people today how to do both adding new segments dynamically and removing segments once they're off screen. So let me put these initial segments back, and we'll take a look at the code that does this. The code that handles this is actually first, let's go ahead and look at game.lua. If we look at game.lua on line 72, you'll see a line here that says listen, enter frame, and then enter frame the function. So what this is going to do is I've got an enter frame function that gets called every time the frame has changed. So the game goes along, it does everything it needs to in one frame, and then it stops in a sense. It doesn't really stop, but what happens is there's a handoff from our code to the code that is run by Corona. Corona is moving things around, it's handling the physics, it's deciding on whether things need to be rendered, and that all happens between frames. So there's a frame stop, Corona does some work, and then it starts things up again and hands it back off to our code. That's how the game loop works. And so every time a new frame starts, Corona puts out an event called enter frame. And the reason they do that is to allow us to make decisions and do things and detect changes since the last frame was rendered. So we use this, among other things, for our camera code. If you'll recall from last week, our camera code, every time the enter frame event occurred, it would say, where was the player last time? Let's move the world the exact direct option. So if the character moved to the left 10 pixels, it would move the world, which contained all of the layers and the player, the other direction. So minus 10 pixels for the player, plus 10 pixels for the world. And so what that did was it kept the player in the center of the screen. So that's great for the camera, but another thing we can use enter frame for is we can check to see, is it time to draw a new hallway segment? Is it time to remove all old hallway segments? So on line 72, I am re-enabling my code here. And let's go ahead and find the enter frame function definition. There it is. So on line 124 of game.lua, you'll find a function that has two lines in it. The first one is a call to a function within the wall module that says remove segments if needed, and the second one is draw segment if needed. I'm gonna uncomment the draw segment portion first, and we will take a look at that.
And Ed,
yes,
not to interrupt your flow here, of course you've set how many frames per second are happening in
config?
In the config.lua file, so it's already limited to this is going to happen 30 frames per second.
That's right. I think we showed the config.lua earlier on in this series.
Right, I just wanted to revisit that for people that might be wondering how often is this going to fire.
Right. So this will fire. I've set this one up for 30, which is a good. Basically, in Corona, you have two choices: 30 and 60. Most of the time, I suggest people put it at 30 as a starting point, and only ramp it up to 60 if they feel like they've got some kind of thing in their game where they're not seeing it's not smooth. They need to make finer adjustments. I mean, it's really hard to talk to exactly the reasoning behind 60. But I say 30 because most of the time 30 frames a second is sufficient for a nice looking game or application. And if you've got a bunch of enter frame calculations or operations going on, the higher you put your frame rate, the more often that work is going to get done. And if you're working with a slower device and you're running at 60 frames a second, and you're doing some really heavy-duty calculations, like a lot of 2D math or whatever it may be, maybe accessing the persistent storage or something, you could bog down the slow people's devices, and you'd think, oh, good, it's working great for my test device, but then 70% of the world who's running on slower devices will say, this thing is lagging out or it's slow, what's going on? And all you had to do was say, well, run it at 30 frames a second, it would have been fine. but you basically doubled your work by switching it up to 60. So I'm running at 30, which means that every approximately, it's not exact, frames are not, it's a good thing you brought that up actually. Side topic, one of the things that's really confusing for new users is when they hear frames per second, they say, okay, 30 frames per second, that means every 33.33 milliseconds, there's going to be a new frame. And then they just say, okay, good, then I want my thing to move at this many pixels per second. Let me do the math, multiply, or divide, or whatever the operation is. Well, what they're not accounting for is that is not how it works. What really happens is every time Corona says, okay, stop working, it's my turn to do some work, Corona then says, okay, let's see, I got 10,000 objects on the scene, I got to move them around, I got to do the physics calculation. Basically, Corona will not let go until it finishes the work it needs to do in that interframe period. So you got frame 1 ends. And then between frame 1 and frame 2, there's a period of time when Corona is doing work. It's creating objects, destroying objects, cleaning up memory, doing some physics calculations, whatever your game or application is doing. And so, assuming that it can get all that work done before it's time to display the next frame, so if it can get it all done in 33.3 milliseconds or less, you'll stay pretty much on track. But even then, there's factors involved here that keep it from being consistently the same duration. So when you're doing calculations on frame, you need to measure the time since the last frame and use that number. In fact, Rob, I think, did an article on this last year that was a great article. And in a nutshell, you basically calculate the time it has been since the last frame, and you use that for your speed calculation or your movement distance calculation. And then, frame to frame to frame, assuming that your game is completely lagging out, you will see nice, consistent, smooth movement. At least it will be better than what the naive approach would produce. Now, in our game, I'm using all naive approach, mostly, because the calculations are more involved, and I didn't want to go into explaining them. And in a very lightweight game like this, you're not going to see any problem. Also, I'm mostly relying on physics for movement, and physics is happening in the background. Physics movement is handled by Corona, so frame to frame to frame, as long as I'm not getting a frame lag, it will be smooth. But anything involving you calculate, like if I were calculating the camera movement or something, that could look a little sketchy if I started to get a lot of frame lag or stretch or time, like say one frame took 60 milliseconds and the next one took 15 because it tried to catch up, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, drawing a new segment. In essence, what do we need to do here? We want to draw a new segment of our hallway, but we don't want to do it until we need it. So how do we determine when we need it? What we do is, first we need to remember is to have a table. We can actually, I'm going to say that you can ignore this first line here, 177. What I'm doing basically is when the game loop starts up, I don't want it to start trying to draw segments until I've created a table where I store them and the player object is present, because there's no point in trying to draw more segments if there's no player yet. So in the beginning of the game, I initialize the wall module, and this code should never execute, but I like to be safe. So just in case, I put a check in here that says don't do anything if you can't find the player, because the subsequent calculation here requires that you have the player. So if you've got no player, this will crash. So line 1 of this function, I call the player module and I say give me the player, which may either return a reference to the player or it will return nil if there is no player yet. Assuming that we get past this part where I have a place to store my wall segments and my player exists, the only other thing I need to do is say, since the last time I drew a wall segment, and I'm keeping track of the last Y position of my wall segment, the point where if we look at the game, for this wall segment right here, last Y is right here. Then if I were to restart the game, this wall segment right here, this path segment, last Y is right here, and then this path segment, the last Y is somewhere up here. What we're keeping track of is where the last vertical ending point was, and our calculation is, we just calculate the distance between where the player is now and where that ended, and as soon as we get close enough, we draw another segment. So that's, I take the player position, I subtract the last Y position, and this gives us a delta Y, and then I compare that to my minimum draw distance, which is just some value, which in this case I've made it very short so we can see the wall segments coming in. So if I run this now, and if I actually tap the screen, you'll see that I go down the hallway and the wall segments suddenly appear, which we don't want. But I've made the minimum distance very short, so it doesn't draw the hallway until I'm almost at the turn.
Gotcha.
So what I can do here, if you're playing with a code, is I can go in here and locate min offset, which is the top. And I made it 50 pixels. But in reality, when I'm playing a game, I want to make it about twice the height of the screen, so it's way off the screen. So by the time I get there, the wall segment will have been drawn. I'll never see any popping. Now if I restart the game, and if I steer, gotta remember steer. Okay, can't play my own game. As I steer along, I will never run out of hallway because off screen it's being generated. It's drawing all these segments, and way above the top of the screen is the last Y position. And as soon as I get within 2 full screen heights of that position, I draw another segment. Let's go ahead and find that again. So as soon as dy is less than that minimum distance, I call the draw segment code, which we talked about last week and the week before, which automatically knows where the last ending Y was. It selects a random hallway length, knows the direction to draw it in, left or right, and it draws that segment. And that's basically all there is to it. So every frame, all we do is we run this little piece of code and say, have we gotten high enough yet to draw another segment? All we have, draw another segment. No, we haven't, don't do anything. As you might suppose, let's go into game for a minute. So in game.lua on line 125, I'm going to uncomment this bit of code that says remove segments if needed. This is the opposite. Now we're saying, again, give me the player. Don't do anything until we've got the wall segments container and we've got the player. Game hasn't really started until those things occur. But assuming that, calculate the distance between the player and a minimum offset which is below the player by 2 distances. And then we go through and we look at every piece of the hallway, the wall segments, the path, the glow, all that stuff that we put into this table previously. If we look up here, this is the bottom part of the wall creation code. And we created the left wall, and we stored it in wall segments using the index of the wall itself. We created the right wall up above, stored it in wall segments. The background, that little square for the corners, path back to the left glow, the right glow, and look at this, a little typo. I stored the wall twice. Okay, you didn't see that. The point being is every time we create a part of our hallway, we store it all in this table, which I created at the top of this file, so it's visible to all the functions below. And then let's go down to our code again. In our remove code, I have calculated a distance, which I just called delete y. I could have called it anything. And then I iterate over every object stored in that table, and I check to see, is that y greater than the delete y distance that I just calculated. So I calculate the distance 1, which is basically a position. So if it's at that position or further, I simply wait 1 second, I remove the object, and I take it out of the table. So for people who are looking at this code and they're a little bit confused, wall segments is a table which has a bunch of objects in it referenced by their own ID. I use the pairs iterator, and the way I use it is always the same. I say for kv, so the key and the value. So the v is going to be the thing that we're looking at in the table, and the k is the key. So for example, if I had a table like this, then I said for kv in pairs t, what this would do is it would randomly iterate over this table. The pairs iterator is not guaranteed to go in order. So in this case, we've created a table that is indexed by numbers, 1, 2, and I'm assuming that we would go on and say T3, etc., etc. Pairs doesn't iterate in order. It just kind of an advanced topic, and Sergey, I see you're here. He could probably chime in on this, but it's a background Lua thing that it goes in there and creates a, I don't even know how to describe it. Yeah, this is kind of, this is very simple and yet very hard to describe. It's going to iterate, I'll just leave it at that. It's going to iterate over this table in a random seeming order, the order that it so chooses, which is based on how the pairs operator.
Where are you looking for the word iterator?
Yeah, go ahead, Sergey.
Where are you looking for the word iterator? That pairs returns an iterator function.
Say again, please.
Did you look for the word iterator? That pairs function returns iterator function for the table T.
Did I look for it?
He's asking if you're thinking of the word iterator.
I am thinking of the word iterator. Oh, you're right. Pairs returns an iterator.
Yes.
And the iterator's job is to, what you would assume, iterate over the table. But how it does so is up to the iterator, and it may not necessarily be in the order that you think it will be in. It's going to be in some order, whatever it so chooses.
Okay. So
internally, the rules, I'm not familiar with how the iterator chooses to go from element to element within the table.
Okay, so a non-sequential order.
It's not the same as if I had done this. That would give me an iterator that would go from 1 to 2 to 3. Whereas pairs could start at 2 and go to 1, and then the next one could be 3. It's random in a sense.
Okay. So, but at some point, T1 is going to be the key, and 10 is going to be the value.
That's right. At some point, K is going to contain 1. B is going to contain 10.
Okay.
Or K will be 2, and V will be 20. So if we delete all this, what we're saying is that we will look at every entry in wall segments. We will get the object that is there and look at its Y position, see if it is a greater distance away than delete Y, and if it is, we'll wait 1 frame, which is what this will achieve. We'll remove it, and we'll take it out of the table. Boy, easy to understand, hard to describe. So now, if I were to unloop this, uncomment this, and I'm going to make this back to 50 because I want people to see it happening. We're going to play the game, and as we play the game, it's going to immediately start deleting these segments as we pass the corners. Every time we get past the corner, or 50 pixels away from our last corner, it's going to remove that segment.
So that makes sense because we're not just creating new segments, but we're also leaving old segments behind, which eats up memory. So
right. So here we are preventing ourselves from filling up memory with hallway segments which have long since served their purpose. All right. I'm kind of doing a rough job describing today. So let's put this back to 2 times the height of the screen. And let's make one more change. Let's make that first segment 1,000 pixels long. Where is it? One can't locate it. Why am I not locating it? Okay.
Is that, yeah. Was that
There
one?
it is.
150?
There we go.
There we go.
As people will recall from our previous discussion, you want the first segment to be long so it's completely off the screen. Covers the entire width of the screen, and we're good to go. So two things we still need to do, which will go more quickly than this discussion. We need to add some particles, so we're similar in a sense to the game that we are making a clone of. And we need to do something as soon as we hit a wall, which is we want to restart the game. We'll approach our restart in a more robust fashion in later weeks, but right now we simply want to get the game running over and over to verify that the logic is all working. So let's go ahead and do the restart first and finish off with the particles. If you'll recall, the way this code has been set up is there's some initialization code in all of the different modules. So there's an init function generally. There is a start function, which is to say start the game actually playing. There's a stop function, which says, okay, we're done, stop playing. Don't let the player move anymore. Don't make any more track segments. Stop listening to the enter frame, etc., etc. And then we have a cleanup function. And its job is to go through and remove all of the game objects and to clean it up as if the game had never started. So as you might imagine, if we started the game and then 1 second after we started the game, we stopped it. 1 second after we stopped it, we did a cleanup. We would see something like this. So the game would start, and I didn't even have a chance to get to the end of the hallway before it had stopped and destroyed everything. And this is what we end up with. So to restart the game, using these mechanics, what we really want to do is, assuming that we've run into the wall, and we have stopped the player, then we can simply stop the game, do a cleanup, reinitialize, which will rebuild all our layers, and then start the game over again. So we've added a function to game Lua, which, when called, will, in one frame, call the stop, in the next frame, or the next time after that, available after that, it will do a cleanup. The next time available after that will initialize, and then after some period of time, if we don't specify it, it'll be 1 second, 1,000 milliseconds, we'll restart the game. So to test this, before we hook it up to the game code, we can just go to main Lua, where we do an init at the beginning. 1 second later, we start. I'm going to make the wall segment shorter too, so you can see this. Start with that short initial segment. We'll start after 1 second, and then half a second later, 500 milliseconds later, we'll call the restart function, and we will tell it, start the game again in 1.5 seconds. We do that, it starts, 1 second, half a second later it restarts, and then it's done, because we didn't put it into a loop. So let's go ahead and comment that out. Go over to the main, go over to player.lua. And if you'll recall from last week, we had a collision function here on line 70 that basically, when we hit a wall or we hit anything, we called the player's stop function, which set the player's velocity to 0 and marked a flag is running, change that to false, and then printed out a message. Let's see here. So what we want to do is, actually I got to step back here. Let's take a look back at game. One additional thing that I did here is you might recall from previous weeks where I said when you are developing an application or you're writing a game, you'll find yourself in a situation where you have one module that uses the contents of another module. So module A uses module B. But sometimes you'd like module B to be able to tell module A to do something. So you get into this kind of conundrum because module A can simply require module B and then call the functions directly through module B's handle. But you can't then in module B require module A because you'll create this loop where Lua is trying to include one file in another file, and then it gets there and says, oh, I need to go get that other file, and you create a loop. I'm waving at the screen like you can see me. So how do we solve this? What I encouraged people to do was to consider using custom events. So in a previous episode, I took and created 3 functions which are shortened names for existing functionality in Corona. So in Corona we have runtime add event listener, runtime remove event listener, and runtime dispatch event. I took those and I like to shorten them up a little bit, and I created 3 functions which do the same thing, call those functions, but they're called listen, ignore, and post, respectively. So listen is add event listener, ignore is remove event listener, and post is a renaming and a slight variation on how you would call dispatch. The reason I'm bringing this up is we have created within game a restart function. But if you remember, game requires the player module. So it's already grabbed the player module. So I couldn't just go into player module and say local game m equals require scripts game. Because this would create a loop. Game would try to get player, player would try to get game, Lua would crash. At that point, it would give you an error message. So instead, because I want to use the restart function out of game, what I will do is after I have defined restart, at the bottom here, I will create a function called onRestart, and within there, all it does is call the restart function. And then using my shorthand notation, I will say listen for an event called onRestart, and when you get that event, call this function, which in turn calls restart and does what we want it to do. So subsequently, in player, type never fails to fail when you're trying to demonstrate something. Bear with me? Okay, that's because I changed the message. At this point, if I want to restart the game, all I've got to do is say everything else will work just as it did before. The player will collide with a wall. It will remove the listener for the collision. We don't need it anymore. It will stop the player, which sets the velocity for the player to 0, and sets the isRunning flag to false. Nothing else left there to do. And then I will post an onRestart event, which the game module is here listening for. It will catch that, and it will run public restart, which is it'll run the game module restart. Just to save this all, restart it, and let it hit the wall. So you can see here that it's hitting the wall, and as soon as it does, boom, it restarts the game, and then 1 second later it starts moving again. This is not exactly the behavior I want. Yes, I want it to restart, but I want there to be a little bit of a delay, just so you can see that you messed up and you hit the wall. So I'm going to change this a little bit. If you look at the way I defined it here below, this function will receive an event, and it looks within the event for a field called delay. So using my post function in player, if I want to add a named parameter, I simply pass in a table and I put the word delay, which is the parameter that I want to set. Let's say after a collision I want it to wait 2 seconds to restart moving. I'm actually giving this example wrong, but I'll just do this anyways. We still got the same problem, but now it starts moving 2 seconds after redrawing the scene. So what am I doing wrong? What I'm doing wrong is I'm calling this right away. Instead, what I could do is simply say timer perform with delay, or I could use Sergey's next frame function, but I won't. That's part of SSK, taken from Sergey. And let's say I'm going to hit the wall, everything is stopped, I want to wait 3 seconds, and then I want to redraw the game, and then 2 seconds later I want it to start. So I say 3 seconds, 3,000 milliseconds, function, I pass in what is called a closure, which is just a function to wrap some actions. And that's it. So all of the stuff that happened previously will happen. It will wait 3 seconds. It will post this event. That will cause everything to redraw. Then I said delay 2,000. It'll wait an additional 2,000 milliseconds, 2 seconds, and the game will start up again. Start it. Hits the wall. 3 seconds. Boom. 2 seconds. Start again. Endless loop. Now we have a completely playable prototype, and we can play with other features until we're happy with it.
So it's worth noting at this point that we're opting to not have any sort of user interface elements, just so that we can test the game, right? So we can
Right. At this
develop.
point, we're still testing the game to make sure that it doesn't crash, doesn't have any other issues, stuff like that. Then we'll layer on scoring, a framework to go around it using Composer, and some other details. So particles. I know that we're right up against the clock, but the particles are really, really simple. It's sort of like an explore on your own kind of thing. Of course, I don't have the file open.
And this, again, the code will link to the code will be available in the show notes. So go grab this and check it out. Ed will show us how to enable it, but you'll want to go through and make it your own.
So there's a module file called particles.lua under the scripts directory, and it follows the same format pretty much as the other ones, except it does not have an initialization. Instead, it's just got a function called draw. And what we do is we pass into draw the group, the layer that we wish it to draw in, the object where we want the particle to be near. So the object in this case is our player. We want the particles to be drawn near our player. Whoops, and then we do that. And then we pass in a radius, which is to say, assuming that the center of the object is where we want the particles to start, we may want to draw our particles at some distance away from the center. And so we will draw at some distance, particle radius, around the center of our object. Find the window here. We're going to draw at the center of the object plus some radius, and we're going to draw randomly some particles here. I'm going to run out of time here, but in a nutshell, what this thing does is we decide how many particles we want to draw per frame. It's a variable that I set at the top of the file. So every frame I draw 2 particles, and I randomly draw an image at some position around the center position of this object, our source object, which is the player. Yeah, I'm going to run out of time. This is it's more complicated than I thought.
Yeah, I tell you what. Let's hold it for next time.
Next week.
Yeah. Is there a place where you can just enable it and show people?
I will show it to you. So let's go ahead and let's walk through. It's in the player code.
So that so your homework as the viewer of this program will be to go out and get the code and pick through it, and then next time Ed will explain more details.
Explain in more detail how it works.
Yeah.
At the top of player, we require the module scripts particles. We store it in particle M, which is my naming convention in this series. And then we simply, in the enter frame function, so every frame the player, as you recall, updates the camera position. What we also wanted to do is every frame is to tell the particle system to draw however many particles it's supposed to draw. So you simply uncomment that. Remember, we pass in a group. We're going to tell it to put all of the particles in layer content 3. Self, which is the player in this function, we're going to say center them about this object, the player, but with a radius of whatever the player's radius is, -4. In other words, somewhere between here and -4 pixels from the edge, randomly within this sphere or this circle, we're going to draw a particle. If we restart this now, did I save? Let's see is that it is randomly producing 2 particles every frame, which, because the particles, as we'll see next week, take some time to dissipate, in a sense, it looks as if we have quite a few more. And so when we do this, just the very, very basic particle effect and a trail so we can see where we've been. Which is,
Nice.
if you look at the original game, is quite similar. The big difference here is in the original game, they also do some blending of these particles and color variations to make it look a little more pleasing, aesthetically pleasing.
But from a functional standpoint, there you go. You've got particles coming off the player, and we've said several times that you can spend endless amount of hours tweaking the look and feel of something, but functionality-wise, there it is.
Yeah, basic functionality, that is what they're doing. One thing that I had considered doing that we still could do is there's a particle system out there called CB Effects. I'm going to switch the camera off now. There's a particle system out there produced by Caleb, I can't remember his last name, and he made this himself. It's a wonderful particle system, and we could, in theory, hook the CB Effects particle system up and use that to produce our particles. Because instead of going through all the weird calculations, we can just say, hey, use a ready-made library. 2 lines of code later, we've got beautiful particles coming out of our player.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what tool you used in order to come to those settings, but we can talk more about that later
The tool
next
was
time.
called randomly choosing values until I saw what I wanted to see. I knew generally what I wanted to do already.
Nice. So poke Ed with a stick. Good, got it.
Poke Ed's brain with a stick until you get the values out that you want.
That's good. All right, well, that's excellent. So now we've got endlessly generated walls. We're cleaning up our memory as we go. We've got particle effects coming off the player object, and the level restarts automatically when we crash into a wall, which we are ultimately going to do because at some point we will speed up the process faster than what we have right now. But for testing purposes, we've slowed it down.
And we have a simple camera system.
Yeah, we have a simple camera system, so we're well on our way to having something that we can be proud of.
Yeah, and it's very simple. And I just want to point one thing out. Last week I said, or maybe it was a week before, we were kind of joking about, oh, don't just take this and like when we get done with the series, just publish this and go, hey, look, I made a game. Make something new and different. Well, as I said earlier in the show, I'm working on my 5th game. My 5th game, I took this code. I said, you know what, I'm going to take this code. I wrote part of this already. Now, it's not a zigzag anything like it, but it still uses some of the core mechanics out of here. And that's where my next game is coming from. So it's really simple, and I really encourage people, once they understand how this code works, is to take it, twist it, explore with it, and do something new.
Well, I don't know if you saw the video where John Romero talks about Corona and what it can do and stuff like that, but he says in the interview that one of the biggest problems that game developers are facing is creating something that somebody has never seen before.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's so many variations, there's a certain number of game mechanics and a certain number of of things that have already been done, and then you take variations of those things and create games, and then it gets to the point where it's like, well, yeah, you could pick anything, right? You could pick and say, oh, well, I've seen that before. Well,
I would posit that if you took apart any game and really examined the individual mechanics components, you could say that they've all been done before.
Yeah.
Now, maybe combined differently or given different aesthetics, but the core mechanics, there's just a limited number of core
Right.
mechanics.
Right. Is there? Does anybody know if there's a book? Is there like a is there like a mechanics book?
There are books out there and there are lists out there, but none of them does what I find to be a suitable. This is one of those like it's just things where you ask 10 people, you get 10 different answers.
Very subjective. Yeah.
Yeah, it's extremely subjective.
Interesting. You see, because it seems like it would be worth nailing down. I mean, just like we talk about, I mean, endless runner or platformer, or being able to put labels on things. It seems like it would be good just to have a book that's just sort of, especially for people who are sort of getting into the game development space, to be able to say, oh, well, here are some common concepts.
There are a few out there, but they tend to be very language specific. There's several out there on C++ that the GEM series gives a lot of different examples on physics capabilities, but again, they're language specific instead of SDK. And that's one of the things we do run into is different platforms. Each are going to have, while they're all using the same basic models, the language does create some variations.
Interesting. Well, that might be an opportunity for somebody to write a book. Because
I've tried to make that list many times. I've never been successful.
Yeah, you've tried to make that list. Well, hey, we've got a special guest with us, Sergey. Thanks
good time.
for joining us. Yeah, it's been a while since we've seen you in Hangout.
He's telling me my code sucks over here in the group chat.
Get off our lawn!
He says, you're an old man.
No, he hasn't been around for weeks on end, and he just comes back swinging.
It just feels natural to blame
He lands
somebody.
one right on my nose. It's not hard to miss, but geez.
What was that, Sergey?
I said it feels. What did I say?
Legacy
You
stuff?
said no parentheses.
Yeah, you said no parentheses. Don't put parentheses. That's legacy stuff.
I disagree.
Semicolons all the way.
But you don't need them, so why
You don't
do
need them.
Since we're 4 times your age at least between us, we're
Probably more than that.
I'm 35.
I agree with you, Sergey, that they are not required, but I think that it's a good practice because it gives the eye a nice visual cue.
yes.
It
And it's
also,
for learning.
I think mostly parentheses are useful with regards to order of operation. But
Yes.
they still control that.
Yeah, but
It's when you need them, but it's not necessary for everything.
I just don't, well, okay. And the reason I say I always encourage people to do parentheses all the time is because I really hate to see code where like half of it's got no parentheses and sometimes there's parentheses. It's just,
Oh, that's
I'm
different.
old.
That's
I'm old. It's very
inconsistency.
confusing for me.
Inconsistency is bad. So
I-
it's
I-
better to have all parentheses if rather than mixed. But it's better for me if there are no parentheses because they really strike the eyes with what you don't have to see. Like, I don't know how it feels.
I always feel like it's different for me. I have trouble reading the if statement if I don't know where the body of the if is.
Right.
yeah. I like to start off my program with Lua, mix in a little JavaScript, and end with some COBOL.
But you know what? Your opinion is perfectly valid, and
We're going to ignore
I
it.
don't agree this time. I oftentimes agree with you, though. So
Well, and
For
it's,
example, if you can code less, but still readable.
yeah, and there are some people who like if you do an if statement, like let's say in JavaScript, you can put the brackets, the curly braces around the statements, or you can leave it off, right? You can just and some people have a preference, a very committed preference to one or the other, and I think there's good arguments for both, and it comes down to style. I tend to like to put them in, that way I know there's a beginning and an end, and I can kind of just visually cue that off, but some people like to leave them off, that way they can have less code.
or just because I'm old.
That's the
Sergey never said that though, because Brian was the one that said that. But still,
I fully accept my age.
all I gotta say to you, Sergey, is as Brian said, "Get off my lawn."
Oh, that's good stuff. That's good stuff. Well, hey, that's it for this week. Like I said, go back and look at Hangout 129, 130, 131, 132. We've got lots of great stuff there. and then definitely go download the code and mess with it. Like we said last time, the only way that you're going to internalize it, make it your own, kind of own the code, is if you experiment with the values that are already there. So go do that, and then we'll be back here next week. We'll talk about the particle effects, how they work, and then we'll look at scoring, adding some collision sensors, and are we going to get to the interface? We're going to do some interface stuff maybe for the counter?
Yeah, it should be as simple as putting in a text field and a counter.
We'll see. We'll get as far as we can. Let's try to get as far.
I'll try to be a little more organized. I might not use any parentheses next time, so it'll go faster.
Just don't explain pairs next time. We'll be all right.
I know. Don't go off on a rabbit hole. That's the problem. Especially when you're not prepared. I'm like Alice, very much in this respect.
Yes,
not prepared for the rabbit hole at all.
It goes very deep. Okay. That's all right. So be back here next Monday, 12 p.m. Pacific, to talk all about mobile app development using Corona SDK. Until then, have a great weekend. Happy coding. Was that a whisper?